Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Can we ask now Mark to deliver his keynote lecture, Knowledge Ecosystems, Data-Intensive Science is More Than Speeds and Feeds. Mark.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks everyone at Microsoft Research. Dan Fay, it was quite an honor. I tell you, it was a real shock when I was sitting on the tarmac on a United Airline flight in Washington Dulles where the pilot had said, well, we got all these warning lights come on, and we're going to sit here for half an hour, and so you can turn on your cell phone. So I checked email, and there was one from Dan Fay. Hey, congratulations on the next Jim Gray Award winner. I thought, Dan, doggone you, what did I do wrong to tick you off? But it turned out then we taxied another half an hour and sat, and I could turn the email on again, and an email from him and Tom McMail at Microsoft. So I thought, gee, this is real. So I'm really honored. I met Jim Gray at a couple of meetings involving the Ocean Observatories Initiative, where there was a room full of oceanographers who were used to flat files in RS-232, and that's what they wanted to do for cyber infrastructure. And in the other corner were a bunch of computer scientists from various institutions, University of California, San Diego, and they wanted to do things like object-oriented databases and workflows, and there was just no communication going on, and Jim said, you're both wrong. How do I bring real computer science down into the real science and get you to work on real problems? And that was really an important lesson that I learned from Jim. And so this talk is really not your usual talk. I usually don't use a script, but I thought I had a lot of ideas that I wanted to go through, because it's not going to be about earth science. It's not going to be about just oceanography. It's not going to be about the wonders of information technology that we have today to support data-intensive science. I'm really interested in how IT and the changes in the kinds of science questions that we're asking really come together in some unexpected ways, and actually ultimately some disruptive ways and maybe even uncomfortable ways, and I hope ways that Jim would find interesting and intriguing, and he put his wonderful creativity and imagination to thinking about. So the first thread that I'm going to introduce into this talk is because long, long ago on a planet far, far away, I got a PhD in ecology and studied about relationships. So this is just one ecosystem. Happens to be a marine ecosystem with some fish and different types of birds and things. And we look at a lot of connections, and there are levels. Some eat others, and some are change what they eat as the environment changes. And we think of these as ecosystems and relatively stable, but we also know that they change a lot, and that there are a lot of pressures due to growth of species that follow sort of exponential curves, and that there are limits in resources, and so we have different kinds of strategies that these various components of the ecosystem follow. Some are what we call specialists. They wait for times to be really good, and so they occupy very narrow niches, and then there are generalists that can thrive in a wide range of conditions, and they explode like this when things are good, and then the specialists kind of go up and they kind of live in a sort of a nice, what we call a logistic curve in a fairly steady environment. But things change, and so you may have seen in your high school biology class when they talk to you about predator-prey relationships, these nice cyclic competition relationships, but more often than not, these are actually fairly irregular. This is now taking those predator-prey curves in various models and looking at them in a phase space where the predator is on one axis and the prey is on the other, and you get these chaotic formula or appearances that appear, these disruptions that happen all the time. Well, on longer time scales, things evolve. So if we look at Darwin's finches here, changes in environment, changes in pressure lead to evolution. And in ecosystems really assume different types of strategies. They become either robust, they resist change, or they become resilient. They can kind of tolerate certain levels of changes. But we also know in the Pacific Northwest of the US, things go extinct. Some of you may remember things like spotted owls, that they were thought, well, they're going extinct because of harvesting of old growth forest. But it turns out that it's now the northern barred owl that's moving into that range and actually eating the spotted owls. So we have things that go extinct, we have variability, we have disturbance. It's all part of an ecosystem that truly is never at equilibrium. We may think that there are some sort of states that are preferred, but these systems are always changing. And so when we study ecosystems, we track things like nutrients and energy. And except for energy, they tend to be fairly closed systems. But when we think about knowledge systems and information technology systems, we're tracking information and data, and we hope that that gets translated through this ecosystem into understanding and innovation. We're really creating stuff that really makes these open systems. And we organize a little bit differently than the traditional ecosystem. It's not only individuals and species, people form institutions, things like journals, professional societies, universities, corporations. All of these now create an ecosystem that's much more dynamic, much more unpredictable than what we have in the natural world. And so when we look at the IT ecosystem or the knowledge ecosystem, we start to see some similarities here. So when we look about data-intensive science, we tend to think, well, it just means big data. Well, here's the classic chart that many of you have seen of transistor counts over time. It only goes up to about 2008. Obviously, it keeps going up and up. That's an exponential curve if you were to plot it on an arithmetic axis, just like our exponential curve of growth. But the fact of the matter is, this isn't big science. 25 years ago, $25,000 bought you 1/4 of a gigabyte of disk. Well, now a 2 gigabyte memory stick is a throwaway item. So what is big is all relative. What's really begins to change is this is a chart from the Akamai real-time web monitor looking at networking. This is now becoming an ecosystem that is changing much more dynamically because of the intense level of connectivity that we have. And we see similar curves like that logistics curve in terms of market penetration, technology getting adapted and adopted in the marketplace. We see extinctions. One of the shortest lived pieces of technology that I know, the zip drive, which was very widespread and then just like vanished. Some of your younger students here probably have said, what is that? So we see a lot of things that look similar to ecosystems, and we can put together food webs or knowledge webs. This is from the Fourth Paradigm book, and you could say, if you were far away, you might say, oh, gee, that's cloud computing. You know, there are actually even little clouds out here. It's actually the NASA EOS-DIS architecture from 25 years ago, which assumed everybody had a VT100 terminal and maybe an RS-232 link. So this is kind of how we've structured ourselves in the face of all this technological change. We still have largely the same sorts of ecosystems that we've built over decades, if not centuries, if you look at universities and journals and how we actually get our science done. So this is kind of the knowledge ecosystem that we have today. A lot of people would hope that we would go back to this system and preserve it as it always has been. But the fact is, some things are beginning to change. So this is just a manifold air pressure sensor on a car. Very high precision atmospheric pressure sensor. Couple that with GPS on a car. Now all of a sudden I have potentially millions of data points of high resolution atmospheric pressure. Think what that could do for weather forecasting. All of a sudden I have a network that right now is built on 5,000 sensors across the continental United States. I could have millions. Now they're not evenly distributed, maybe they're not as precise, but it changes the nature of how I do calibration and validation when I have millions versus a few tens to maybe a few hundred of these types of sensors. I have different kinds of chips. This is just sort of a recent picture of an ARM chip. It could be anybody's chip. But the fact is, it's not that it's just faster. These are now getting into being sub-5 watt parts. That means you can now put almost, what we used to call high-performance computing in small little devices. Start coupling that together. Now your individual species in that food web suddenly become much more capable in what they can do. They start to control their own destiny. You can look at, this is Alex Soleil's similar thing from Backblaze. Here's a petabyte, 80,000, maybe what, 70,000 now, Alex? I don't know what the price is. A petabyte used to be a big stinking deal. It's not anymore. So this leads to this sort of third thread. How does this change, these changes now affect this ecosystem that we've built up in the science world? How do we move forward? It's not just a question of more. It's not just big data. How do I store all these massive data sets after the fact? It really now is that data-intensive science. We're moving really into uncharted seas, and it really ties into what Jim said is, law number one. This is with apologies to Alex's chapter in the fourth paradigm. Scientific computing is becoming data-intensive. It's not just volume. It's a richness and a complexity. It's a diversity of data sources that we've never seen before. Oops. And it also is part of his second law. We're scaling out. So we used to talk about information scarcity, that little video where I talked about those 200 samples of water where a graduate student counted phytoplankton. Those data were really, really precious. Each one told you something and you paid great attention to it. Those 8,000 data points that I collected, you could tolerate a certain amount of noise and imprecision because you were trading off sampling error for the measurement error of the individual sample. So you actually got better statistics out of those data sets than those very precise but very sparse fields that were missing so much of the heterogeneity and ultimately the dynamics of the ecosystem that we wanted to observe. So the question now is not just looking at this information abundance, but what new insights can we deliver? And this really now begins to stress that old sort of NASA EOS-DIS type information ecosystem and even some of the cloud mainframe ecosystems that we're talking about. So as members of that system, what sort of ecological strategies and longer timescale evolutionary strategies might we pursue? And what might be our risks? And how might we manage that? Well, one of the things about knowledge and science is we've always been based on communication. Internet is not a new thing. People were traveling around Europe and eventually the entire world sharing scientific knowledge. Relatively small, but people moved around. They weren't staying put. And there was a recognition that there was a power of collective intelligence. It was not just what Friedrich Hayek wrote years ago, that you cannot substitute the individual all-knowing intelligence for a distributed and fragmented system of localized but connected intelligence. This notion that networks are more powerful than a single entity has been around for a long time. And in fact, if you look at maps of, say, the Silk Road in Asia, these trade in human history actually predates things like agriculture. We were always trading knowledge and things. The interesting thing about that, as Lawrence Reed wrote in his essay over 50 years ago called I, Pencil, nobody, single individual, really knows how or could make a pencil. It's a team effort. It's a community. So that's fine. But now we say, well, okay, we all know we have these networks. We've collaborated. What's different? The issue now, I think, is that the volume and complexity of the data and the fact that we all have more local capabilities begin to threaten a lot of the institutions and processes we put in place. Pencils, and to some extent science, are relatively well-defined, although very complex processes. And it's this confluence of the changes in information technology and the types of scientific questions are leading to new types of questions, which leads to sort of thread 4, which is scaling up and out. The scaling out is now the nature of the scientific questions that we're asking. So here's a climate model. You don't have to worry about it, but there are lots of components here. There's an ocean, there's a land, there's a power plant, there's a farm. There are people in here. There's chemistry in here. There's physics in here. There's biology in here. These are the kind of questions that people are asking and want to understand. Well, this also then makes one of the challenges in this is, How do I publish? Well, Jim, and you saw this chart in some of the talks today, thought that the scientific publication was at the top of the pyramid. You know, this is a very relatively mechanical process. Collect data, analyze data, publish data, get more funding, collect data, analyze data. That's a really good model, and that's always going to continue. It's worked very well. But is there another world beginning to emerge in this sort of hyper-interdisciplinary, hyper-data-intensive world? Maybe it's not just this nice hierarchical process like building a pyramid, which usually had dead pharaohs in the middle, but the fact of the matter is it's not necessarily a village. Villages kind of look friendly, except that sometimes in Italian hill towns you like to go to war with your neighbors. They tend to be relatively insular. In some extent, scientific disciplines have organized around little villages like this, and sometimes we come out and sometimes we don't. Sometimes they're slightly more hostile, where they tend to look at themselves and worry about their own problems. But you can take a climate change problem, or even studies of cancer. These are inherently interdisciplinary problems, where to understand cancer and its causes and its cures is not just understanding the biochemistry and the genomics, but it's understanding how health and diet issues, environmental issues all impact these things. So the question is, this is great. We all believe this. We all think, well, this is going to lead to new types of creativity and collaboration. It's all wonderful. Come down to the river and we'll all believe. But the fact is, these are leading to new disruptions of this ecosystem. And some of these are technical issues, and we heard a lot about this today and over the next couple of days. We are wading through data. As Samuel Coleridge said, water, water everywhere, and ne'er a drop to drink. You know, talking about in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, we're out there, our tools are truly inadequate. The traditional relational database is fine if we understand the relationships and we can organize our data within those databases. They don't scale too well to petabytes. Remember, a petabyte's $80,000. So I'll ask Larry Ellison when he's done sailing, how is he going to scale up a traditional database into these petabyte scales? MapReduce is another method that's out there. It's fine for distributed processing, but the answers that come out of that tend to be sort of, quote, follow the crowd. How do you handle these sort of rare creative insights in these massive as we're massive floods of data? So the new sensors, like that map sensor or even more traditional scientific sensors, are really more like structured streams. They're not the traditional files. So what Jim Gray would say is, well, first what you do is you bring the computation to the data. And that's going to help a lot. And clearly, when you look at the advance in processing power, the advances in storage, you can begin to marry the data collection, the analysis, the storage in a much more integrated and affordable package. But that provides access. As Maria Popova wrote last summer, access cannot be confused with accessibility. You still need somebody or some team to help guide you through that data to set a context. Last year at the eScience conference, Adam Bly talked about context matters for effective collaboration and for openness. We need to understand where we're each coming from. And there are other disruptions to this nice, predictable ecosystem that we put in place. Things are real time. We have what I would call radical personalization of devices. We each have an iPhone or an iPad or a Windows phone or whatever, either in our home or in our car, including scientific instrumentation. Things that used to be the purview of large institutions are now within the reach of individual scientists or small teams. Collaborations form and disperse around specific scientific problems. We're not bound by who happens to be in our department or down the hall. What these do is tend to break up a lot of relationships that have been built up over the years. And Caroline Wagner, in her book a couple of years ago called The Invisible College, noted the changing role of the university in this, that research and education are not bound to specific places or institutions. And how do you maintain the, quote, lines of trade? How do you maintain that Silk Road where people know where to go and how to collaborate? Is it all a many-to-many collaboration in this world. If you ask a young assistant professor, he or she today will say, I have more allegiance to my funding manager at some government agency than I do to my university. They're movable. They're not bound by what the institution can necessarily provide. So how do we maintain that? Well, sometimes it's nice to have a guide like Tenzing Norgay, who can lead you through these realms of very complex data. You also need an Edmund Hillary who can organize the expedition and all the logistics and take the picture. But we need to think about what kinds of scientists we have. Scientists who understand the tools and aren't just users, who can go through these and navigate these hills and valleys and oceans. So what Jim would say is start simple but a little bit broad. Start your design with the 20 questions. Don't be so narrow. But also assume that there's some risk in here. You're going to miss some things. And risk is something where, when you build resilience into an ecosystem, you're assuming that there's going to be some level of failure that you're going to be able to recover from. And I worry that our agencies that largely fund science now are so risk averse, they don't tolerate any failure, and that progress will become incremental as opposed to climbing the top of Mount Everest. We need to think about, are we just pursuing the tried and true, or are we going to do new things? That range of sensors, computation, and storage, things are going to fail. You can't predict and lay out all the metrics of how that's going to work. So that, oops, what did I hit there? Okay, sorry. So that leads to the next thread. Can we respond? Do we have the kinds of communication capabilities to do that? I'm not touching a thing. It must be this Mac. No, it's not a Mac. No, it's taped over. Okay. So one of the things, though, is we still have huge amounts of communication out here. And you can see these kinds of the maps of scientific collaborations. It's interesting. You can see pretty clearly how it's organized around North America, Western Europe, Japan, India, China, a little bit in Brazil, South America, but large parts of the world are relatively blank. And I should say, when we talk about scientific collaborations, this is a map from Boyack et al. In 2006 on how scientific paradigms relate. If you were actually able to see that, you could see that they're still organized largely around discipline lines, that there are still cultural barriers between scientists. And part of it is a language issue. Social scientists speak different languages than ecologists who speak different languages than physical scientists. And generally, when we talk interdisciplinary science, my metaphor is that I think of a gypsy caravan rolling into town, each individual scientist with their little ware that they're going to sell and bring to this particular interdisciplinary party. However, as Sean Eddy wrote years ago, he calls this, really what we need is, he called it antidisciplinary science, A-N-T-E, and those of you who remember your Latin, that means before discipline. People who can really look and innovate and break down those discipline boundaries. Bring disciplinary scientists together, and I've got a team of disciplinary scientists. So this becomes, how do I maintain that link and yet also build up those capabilities? I must have a magnetic personality here. So the other thing that Jim would say is that we're seeing these knowledge ecosystems having different tools, different pressures. Trade and innovation is something scientists are really good at. But this rapid disintermediation, the fact that institutions that used to provide all of the services for us in either storage or computing, publishing or changing, means we really need to think about how we go from working to working. This is really a resilient strategy that we tend to think about data-intensive science as only speeds and feeds. We focus on the new technology and all the new things. We've got to step back and think about what new understandings can I derive from this, which really leads to the final thread is, how might we respond? What kind of new structures, what kinds of new institutions might emerge? Well, sometimes when we think we think data intensive is big. Sometimes it's not big. And I like to tell a story that Nicholas Negroponte, founder of the MIT Media Lab, used to tell, which was that you and your spouse were having a many month-long conversation speculating what were going on with your best friends. You know, there was something funny going on with this other couple, and you couldn't figure out what was happening. You couldn't put the pieces together. So you're at a dinner party together with 4 other couples, and another person at the party makes a comment. And you look at your spouse and you make a wink, and instantly you each know the entire story. The puzzle pieces have fallen together. Negroponte called that the wink at the dinner table, a one-bit information transfer that suddenly created an entirely new story. And how did that happen? Well, first, there was some history and context between the two of you, that you each had been talking. You each had sort of some local processing and storage. But there was also some intense connectivity between the elements. So we tend to think that sometimes science is this nice, orderly, regular process and things move up the mountain. But sometimes things happen very creatively and unpredictably. So we often say, well, you know, if we could just create a few more wizards, we could fix all of these data-intensive problems. I'm hoping we create more pathfinders and guides. And this whole disintermediation, we see it in business, we're seeing it in politics, we see it in the social environment, we're starting to see that in the scientific world. And navigating through this is going to require guides and pathfinders and innovators. So I'll just wrap up. So we tend to think that science sometimes is very orderly, like the Gardens of Versailles, with very regular processes. This works. It will continue to work. There will always be Gardens of Versailles out in the scientific world. There are other landscapes, like one by Capability Brown in England, that look organized, but maybe a little more natural, but it's intensely designed and managed. That's another type of scientific garden or ecosystem. And it also works, and it will continue to work, and that's a good thing. But then we have this sort of unruly ecosystem beginning to creep up at the edges of our more controlled and predictable environment. Let's go back again. You know, the Amazon rainforest, which is fairly fragile, tends to be hostile at times, but it's good to have a good guide to go through there. So I think that our lessons are that the disintermediation of IT is changing science. The nature of the scientific questions is changing how we do science, like climate change. The old ecosystems that are out there are going to continue to thrive, but there are these new ones, and these are ones that are going to require taking risks. They're going to require an acceptance of some failure at times, and an ability to pick up and move on. I don't think this is optional. I don't think we can say, no, we're going to go live in Capability Brown's landscape or the Gardens of Versailles. Those days are probably, they're there, but this is what's out there. And this is the kind of thing where you have to suddenly deal with social scientists and people who ask you questions about climate change, which are, how many potholes are going to form in the city of Chicago because of climate change, because the freeze-thaw cycle is going to change, and do I need to change how I start paving roads over the next 30 years? It's a business question, it's a science question, it's a political policy question. Those are ones that scientists say, I don't want to answer that question because I can't get published. But those are the kinds of questions that get asked. Those are actually kind of interesting questions. So that's the kind of world that we're going to have out there. So this ecosystem, like all ecosystems, change is going to happen unexpectedly. And I'll end with one example. This is the hardwood forest in the central US, the northern part up around Minnesota. On the left is this nice understory full of sugar maples and other seedlings. On the right, same area. That understory is completely gone. The sugar maples are not reproducing, they're not surviving, and you say, why? Earthworms. Earthworms were wiped out in the last ice age. They came over from Europe in the 1500s, and now they've changed and migrated. They've changed the soil and how it compacts there. Sugar maples don't survive. A completely unexpected change, an enormous, significant change by a fairly small organism in a fairly innocuous process of settlers coming from Europe, the old world, to the new world with muddy boots that had earthworms on them. So the point is that we're going to see a lot more of these changes. These new technology just isn't going to be tweaking these ecosystems. As Jim would say, it's a creation of a new type of science with new institutions and new cultures, and it's far more than speeds and feeds. Well, like every talk that has several threads or themes in it, you always have to have a coda, and I'm going to say there's at least one caveat that I want to talk about. And that is, as we talk about all these sensors, and as sensors in some sense become encapsulated in software, they become models that encapsulate our assumptions, our biases, our guesses as to how the world works. And as scientists become users of data rather than creators of data, we run a risk. And I think it's a risk that we've got to watch, which is a risk of losing innovation, because we don't understand the assumptions, we don't understand the limitations and the biases of these data sets. We become consumers and they're on the web, therefore they must be good. So there's a lot to be said for standing on the fantail of a ship in the Southern Ocean, which I did, looking out and trying to say, I've got this sensor out there, what is it truly measuring? And I think it's going to be a great new world with lots of risk and lots of new opportunities, but let's not forget we're studying something that inherently is very difficult, and I hope we all enjoy the journey. So thank you very much.
So I think we'll postpone questions. If you want, Mark is here. You should come and jump on him. But it's great to hear a dean being so subversive and actually encouraging you to change the world. So enjoy the evening, and let's thank Mark one more time.